Hey everybody, Dr. Dan here, and I'm going to talk about Chapter 6. So we're still in the 1700s, and this chapter is really about imperialism or basically global empire struggles, and mainly between Britain or England and France. And it's important to understand that in the context of what we're studying right now because as far as working our way towards the colonist and independence, American independence, we need to understand what's going on in the rest of the world and why the British wars of the 1700s lead to a movement of independence for the colonists. So basically, it's real easy. I'll sum it up and then I'll get into a little detail. Basically, during the 1700s, what's happening is that England is at war with a lot of people. And most of the time, they're at war with France. Sometimes they're at war with the Spanish. But wars are expensive. And in order to pay for wars, there's increase in taxation imposed upon the colonists by England. So, of course, anytime there is a rise in taxation, people get upset, and that's when things tend to fall apart. So that's sort of the big gist of the chapter. Now, so there's that theme about England being at war all the time. Wars are expensive. They try to raise money from the colonists, and then the other theme is Native Americans, because what's going to happen is the French are going to lose their ground in the Ohio Valley, the area where we're at right now, from Buffalo to Toledo, Detroit. And so as the French sort of get forced out of that area, and the French were the main trading partners for the Native Americans, now the British are going to come in and deal with the Native Americans, and that's really not going to go very well. So in a way, this same period of time where there's struggles for empire between France and England is also the beginning of the end of any Native Americans sort of in the Midwest. It'll take a little longer, but it really is the beginning of the end. So this idea of alliances between Native Americans and the French certainly comes to an end during this period of time. So as you start this chapter, you're going to read a lot about a lot of little wars, and I mean the specific battles and wars really aren't that important. But and there's some cool ones. There's like the War of Jenkins' Ear in 1739, kind of a fun war, only because Captain Jenkins, who is a Brit, goes in front of Parliament holding up his ear, what he claims is his severed ear, and he claims that the Spanish came onto his ship and cut his ear off, and there's a war over that. So kind of fun to read about that stuff. But again, the point is that there are a lot of wars. So there's Jenkins' Ear, and then the biggie is the French and Indian War, which is really around in the 1750s. So this idea where Britain is battling the French and at the same time the Native Americans. So there's a lot of changes going on as far as what's happening in this country and, well, not the United States yet, but as far as North America is concerned. And there's some maps in the textbook you can look at if you're interested in those battles and what was going on. So again, because the British are fighting so much, they have to raise money, and not only do they try to tax the colonists, but there's the other toll it takes on the colonies is that a lot of men are impressed or basically forcefully drafted to fight for the British. So, especially Massachusetts, there was thousands and thousands of men that had to go fight for the British, and sort of the deal with the colonists was that they didn't really feel like they should send men and finance these imperial battles, because you start to see this idea that the colonists felt that they were somehow separate from the British, although they were certainly part of the British Empire. So that's one thing. The other thing is, as far as the geography is concerned, and as far as domination of North America is concerned, the French and Indian War, which again, 1757, 1758, really ends with the Treaty of Paris, and it's important because with the defeat of the French in the French and Indian War, the British get the Caribbean islands, or most of the Caribbean islands, but they also get Canada, which is a big deal. So again, the French had Canada, and they had that big empire of land to the north, and now all of a sudden the British have Canada after 1758, and the British also get New Orleans from the French with the Treaty of Paris, with the Second French and Indian War. So think about that stuff as you go through the book. As far as the colonists getting upset with the Brits concerned, the Brits really miscalculated things. Not only were they imposing higher taxes on everything, but there were some specific laws that Parliament tried to pass that didn't go well. So there was the Molasses Act of 1733, which the British basically put a duty or a tax on molasses. So all the molasses that was imported or exported into the colonies had this new tax imposed on it. And you might not think molasses is that important, but back then it was really important because you needed molasses to make rum, and that was a real big deal with the colonists. So with this new tax on molasses, the colonists began to protest and began to actually, attack tax collectors. And then there was a Currency Act in 1764 where the British Parliament imposed upon the colonists this idea that you had to use British currency. No longer could independent currency or currency that was unique to the colonies be used for trade. So, of course, that upset the colonists. And then the biggie was the Stamp Act in 1765. And most of you have probably heard of the Stamp Act from high school history. But the Stamp Act was a tax that the British Parliament imposed upon the colonists, and basically any legal document that was used in a court of law, whether it was a deed, any kind of certificates, any kind of legal documents out of court, any legal document had a tax on it all of a sudden. And again, because most of the people that paid taxes or had legal documents were attorneys or lawyers in the colonies, that upset lawyers and it upset a lot of people. So all of these things were an effort for the British to raise money to pay this huge war debt they had, but at the same time, it started to really upset the colonists. So when we get into the Revolution, the War of Independence, which is the next chapter, you've certainly heard of, taxation without representation as a complaint or a battle cry, if you will, for the colonists. So that's really where this starts. The colonists felt that the constitutional system of Parliament, which we'll just call that constitutionalism, was a good system for sure. Everyone in the British Empire felt that Parliament was a good system, but the problem was that there was no representation here by the colonies. So the colonies didn't have any members in Parliament, but at the same time, they were paying taxes, and new laws were being imposed upon them. So the colonists really felt like they didn't have the same rights as an Englishman had. So this idea of the rights of an Englishman, which is fair representation, that was another protest, that we don't have any say in what's going on in government. So again, most of you probably know that from high school history, but just to reiterate, so now we're getting into the mid to late 1700s, running up to the Revolutionary War, and it's important that you make these connections between battle for empire, war debt, and this idea that the British have to raise money, and they sort of pick on the colonists to do that. So, in the last chapter, we talked about this formation of the public sphere, this formation of a feeling of togetherness amongst the colonists. So that idea that the colonists are becoming their own set of people, sort of unique from the British, it also plays a big role here, because when we think of independence, we think of a cohesive group of people, and certainly the colonists were starting to think that they were cohesive, and they were starting to think that they didn't have the rights of Englishmen at the same time. So, we know how that story is going to end as we get in the next chapter. So near the end of this chapter, 1773, 1774, it talks about sort of mob violence, and it talks about the Boston Massacre, which again, I'm sure you guys have heard of. This is a battle where actually it's a legendary, snowball fight. Some mobs, colonists in Boston throw snowballs at British soldiers, and there's this massacre that takes place, this battle that takes place. As a matter of fact, one of the first people to die against the Red Army is a guy named Crispus Attucks, who's a African free black sailor. So that's sort of the stuff of legend also. So keep that in mind. In 1774, the Virginia House of Burgesses, which is like the state house, the Virginia House of Representatives, if you will, send a letter to all the other colonies saying, hey, we need to get together to talk about grouping. So this notion of Continental Congress in 1774 comes about because the Virginia House of, not House of Commons, but House of Burgesses decides it's a good idea for the colonies to start to talk together to start to unify. So all the colonies attend the First Continental Congress in 1774, except for Georgia. So again, we're getting into this idea of revolution, and for the first time, the colonies saying, "Hey, we need to get together because we're not England, and we need to become more independent." So a lot of great stuff in this chapter. I hope you enjoy it. We'll get into Chapter 7 next week, and we'll talk about the Revolutionary War and what's going on there. So keep up the good work. I hope you have a great week. Be safe. If you have any questions, let me know. Bye-bye.